Well, it's a great honor to be here, and I thank so much the Peace Coalition for having me address you this afternoon. I want to talk about Iran primarily. I think it's at the nexus of issues having to do with peace and war, and that it's moving to the front burner. Washington always seems to have wars planned, and so once one fails, then they go on to the other. I can't remember when they had the last successful one, I guess World War II. But it doesn't seem to deter them from continuing these think tanks inside the Beltway, which were founded mostly by billionaires who were tired of uppity professors contradicting them, and who just hired staffs to populate these think tanks, and then the reporters are so lazy they call them, as if you don't know what they're going to say. So they've managed to do an end run around the university experts, and they don't have to deal with our objections to the party line. Iran has been an issue in American foreign policy since 1941. And it has continued to be an issue all this time. There's an old Greek saying that the boys throw stones at frogs in jest, but the frogs die in earnest. Well, that's kind of a summation of the American relationship to Iran. We've been throwing a lot of stones at it over the decades, and we don't think anything out of it. Most Americans don't know where Iran is. They pronounce it Iran, and they can't find it on the map. They know it's bad, probably, but they don't know what we've done to it. Nobody knows, virtually nobody in the public would know that the United States helped to occupy Iran during World War II. They overthrew the sitting monarch of Iran because Iran was then the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, and it was a place from which the Allies could supply the Soviets once they were cut off by the Nazis in the Baltics. And so it was necessary to change the government around and to occupy the place. There was a big famine while we were occupying it. It's not remembered as fondly as a time of great progress in Iran. And then after the war was over, its centrality to geopolitics had been demonstrated. But of course, it also had petroleum. And petroleum became more and more important over time. The British Navy switched to petroleum from coal in 1910. And that pretty much doomed the oil-producing countries to being colonized in one way or another, because the British Navy was one of the more important institutions in the world, and by God, it had to be fueled. But after World War II, of course, the British Empire declined. The American supplanted it in many ways, and the Americans wanted the petroleum not so much for themselves, because the U.S. at the time was a swing producer. Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma and so forth produced a lot of petroleum. But the Middle East petroleum supplied Western Europe and Japan. And as the Cold War began, it was very clear that the U.S. couldn't win its contest with the Soviet Union unless U.S. allies flourished. And so Japan and Western Europe had to be supplied, and Iran was one of those suppliers. In the early 1950s, the Iranians elected a parliament and it was an elected parliament. There were fairly free, fair parliamentary elections in Iran. What all of those think tanks founded by the billionaires in Washington now say they want, that's their fondest hope, they had it in 1951. They didn't like it when they had it. So the elected parliament of Iran had a quibble with the British. The British had developed Iranian petroleum, had found it and developed it, and the British viewed Iranian petroleum as theirs. It actually belonged to Britain. And the Iranians kind of were the landlords of it. And what would you do for a landlord when you were renting his property is you would pay him the rent. So Iran got a rent on the petroleum. Not that much. But the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and notice that the Anglo comes first, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company got most of the profits on Iranian petroleum. And they would have said, if you had pressed them about the inequity of this arrangement, that, well, we found it, we developed it, the Iranians couldn't have done anything by themselves. Yes, but neither could you have developed it if it hadn't been in Iran. There was an agreement in 1933, and that agreement over time came to seem to the Iranians increasingly kind of imperial and unfair. And you know, after World War II, a lot of countries in the global South began asserting their control over their own resources. Chileans got the odd idea that the copper belonged to them. And you know, the aluminum in various countries didn't actually belong to Alcoa, and so forth. So the Iranians began asserting that the oil was theirs, and the American oil establishment was partly to blame for this situation, because during World War II, the Texans found out about Saudi Arabia, and that was a marriage made in heaven. And ever since then, there are like 80,000 Texans living in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, near to the Black Gold. And they founded the American Arabian Oil Company. And they were the new kids on the block, the Americans, with regard to these concessions and oil in the Middle East. The French and the British and the Dutch had it all sewn up. And in order to make their way into that market, the Americans gave away the show. They did a 50-50 split on profits with the Saudis. I can't tell you how upset London was. These upstart Americans are just giving away the show to the locals. They would have been called natives. The Iranians come to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and say, we want a 50-50 split on profits, just like Aramco gave the Saudis. And the British said, not on your life. So it was very bitter. And at the end of the day, the British refused to negotiate. And so the Iranian parliament said, okay, well, it's our oil. We declare it nationalized. Go home. And they kicked the British out. It was the first time the British had really been kicked out of a southern global south country in a long time. And they were no longer a great empire by now. The empire, they'd lost India, and I think it was really hard on them psychologically. So, you know, one of the primary British politicians at that time, Anthony Eden, prided himself on knowing Persian, the language of Iran, and would study the Persian poets for their wisdom. This was a sort of East India tradition. Diplomats around Eden say he was insufferable, that he kind of gave you to understand if you wanted to amount something in the British diplomatic corps, you really had to have good Persian. So to be kicked out of Iran, you know, was the final nail in the British Empire. And so MI6, the British intelligence, decided that they weren't going to take this lying down, and by God, if the Iranian government was going to act this way, then it would be overthrown. And they made a plan for a coup. But the Iranians very cleverly had kicked out all the British and their agents. And so there was nobody on the ground to implement the coup. And MI6 came to understand it just wasn't plausible. But the Americans still had assets in Iran, and so MI6 passed the plan over to the CIA. And Truman was still in, and the CIA knew that Harry would go ballistic if they mentioned any such thing to him. So they waited, and then Eisenhower was elected. And when Eisenhower was inaugurated, then the CIA brought over the plan to the general, and he kind of liked it. And so they coordinated with the right wing of the Iranian officer corps. There I've been redundant. And then they sent, at the time, it wasn't a funny name. You know, it was a member of the Roosevelt family who was a cousin of President Roosevelt, who was a CIA operative. But in posterity, the whole thing becomes a little bit faintly ridiculous. They sent Kermit Roosevelt to Iran with bags of money, probably millions of dollars, to buy crowds. And they coordinated with the officer corps. So, and then in the meantime, during the period in which this coup was planned out and implemented, the Seven Sisters, the oil companies in the United States, put enormous pressure on Eisenhower, and then, of course, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now BP, put enormous pressure on the British government to have a complete boycott of Iranian petroleum. That if Iran now owned its petroleum, and it kicked out the British, but it wouldn't do it any good, they said, because they wouldn't be allowed to sell it. It would just have to stay in the ground, and the Iranian economy was going to be ruined. So the Italians and the Japanese were kind of tempted to wildcat and to buy Iranian petroleum on the sly, and the U.S. ambassadors in those countries wrote them sharp letters, and Italy was threatened with having its loans pulled in. And so the U.S. and the U.K. organized an international boycott of Iranian petroleum, and the nationalist government in Iran had been very popular when it came in. The prime minister was a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, who believed in the oil nationalization. They lost their popularity because the economy went to hell. And then by the time the crowds were bought and the generals were put in place and so forth, it was fairly easy to make a coup against the national government. And the Shah of Iran, who had been put on the throne by the Allies when they deposed his father back in the early 40s, had to flee the nationalists. He went to Italy, and the Americans brought him back, put him on the throne, and built him up as one of the world's supreme megalomaniacal rulers. He put on enormous errors. He claimed to be the last in the line of, or the most recent in the line of 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy. Now, I'm a historian, and I just want to alert you that there haven't been 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy. It is true they had kings in ancient times like Cyrus the Great and so forth, but there was that little interlude when the Arabs ruled them that they're not mentioning, and the Turks and so forth. But in any case, the Shah, his uniforms became more and more extravagant as his ego became bigger and bigger. He developed a seedy police state. They had more prisoners of conscience by the mid-'70s than the Soviet Union did. And he was just, he looked a little bit like Liberace towards the end. It was embarrassing. And then he angered the Iranians in so many ways. He had U.S. bases on his soil. He gave the soldiers extraterritoriality. So if an American GI ran over an Iranian, there was nothing that could be done about it. He spent a lot of the oil money on buying American weapons, so he kind of cycled it back to Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Bell Helicopter and so forth. And then he was running this police state. You couldn't criticize him, and the censorship became extreme. You couldn't criticize anything about the Shah. I mean, you could sometimes criticize lesser figures in his government. But the novelists and the short story writers who were more political started using a lot of metaphors, like night fell upon the land, and that meant the Pahlavi regime had taken over with CIA help. So the censors were not stupid. So they issued this order that no more night scenes in the novels. So the Iranians made a revolution against that government, which was quite insufferable. And, you know, there were 1,000 families that kind of had locked up most of the wealth. There were enormous shanty towns. And in 1978-79, they overthrew it. And they overthrew it. It was a very broad coalition of people that overthrew that government. High school teachers went on strike, and oil workers, and leftists, and Muslim fundamentalists. Very unfortunately, after the revolution was over, Khomeini, Ruhollah Khomeini, the leading dissident cleric, hijacked the revolution and destroyed his liberal and leftist oppositions. There was a great terror in the 80s. 10,000 people were killed. People were arrested and dragged out of high school for saying the wrong thing and taken out and shot. And they implemented this very hard line, what they called an Islamic State, although many of the Muslims were appalled at how harsh it was and didn't think that was very Islamic. And because of the resentments of the United States that were fostered by the CIA coup of 1953, the regime gravitated towards an anti-American position. It wasn't, when the revolution first occurred, it wasn't clear what would happen with Iran and the United States, and there was a famous handshake between an interim prime minister and the Secretary of State at the time, but then the radicals took the American embassy in late 79, and we had the hostage crisis, and that was the beginning of a period of very bad relations between the Iranian government and the United States. The Reagan administration that came into power after the hostage crisis was resolved, and who knows, may have had something to do with behind the scenes resolving it, wanted to open Iran back up, and so they tried to play footsie with Khomeini. And there were many pieces of that puzzle. It's a complicated story. I can't go into all of the details, but basically, during the Iran-Iraq war, because Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, Reagan played both sides. He supported Iraq mainly, but then he also ordered people to go into the Pentagon warehouses and steal large anti-aircraft batteries and ship them illegally to Iran, which was on the terror watch list, and then took the money that Iranians paid for this stolen equipment and gave it to death squads in Nicaragua. So that eventually became known as the Iran-Contra scandal, and it is fiendishly clever, but also you might as well have taken the U.S. Constitution and just fed it through the shredder, because Reagan had been forbidden to support the death squads by the Boland Amendment by the Democratic Congress, so he needed a slush fund of money to support them, which didn't come from the United States. So that's why he stole the weaponry from the warehouses and sold it to Iran. And they named the airport in Washington, D.C. after him. I mean, really? Sold TOW batteries to Khomeini, and you name an airport after him? I don't know. Somehow he was forgiven for all that, assuming that it wasn't actually done by Bush Sr., because Reagan probably had early onset Alzheimer's. I noticed when W got in, he immediately issued an order that the rate of declassification of documents from the 80s should be slowed. I think there may be stuff in there. Well, after the Iran-Contra scandal crashed and burned, Iran and the United States were at a standoff, and there was something in the 90s called dual containment, which was famously during the Iran-Iraq war, Henry Kissinger said that the terrible thing is that both sides cannot lose. So that was a kind of nasty attitude towards the poor Iraqis and Iranians who were suffering in that war. But dual containment was that we would make them both lose. We would put sanctions on them and harmed their economies, and Congress put on American sanctions on both countries, and then the UN was persuaded to put sanctions on Iraq. And so there's dual containment. These two big countries abut the Persian Gulf, where about a fifth of the world's petroleum comes out of, and both of them were enemies of the United States. And the U.S. and its allies depended heavily on that petroleum that came out of the Gulf. So they wanted to contain both of these hostile countries. And it was a stupid, it was a stupid policy. A bright man came up with it, Martin Indyk, who was in the Clinton administration, but it was a stupid policy and obviously not sustainable in the long run. And one of the first people to challenge it was the former Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration, who oversaw the Gulf War, Richard Bruce Cheney. I always give his three names because typically that is how you refer to a felon. Cheney had defended not going on to Baghdad and conquering Iraq in a C-SPAN interview in 1994 after the Gulf War on the grounds that he said, well, if you went into Iraq and overthrew its government, wouldn't you have to stand up a new one? And wouldn't that be difficult? And who knows how long it might take? And then if you did that, wouldn't the Shiites in the south become restive and hook up with the Ayatollahs in Iran? And wouldn't the Kurds spin off and annoy the Turks? And you would have, resistance to the Americans being there, and troops would die. And how many troops, really American troops, would Saddam be worth? And he said, in our estimation, not a single one. So I kind of like that guy. I don't know where he went after that, but we know where he went. He went in 1995 to become the CEO of a medium-sized oil services company named Halliburton. And somehow, if you play golf in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston for a while, you begin to be worried about oil. And I argue that in the late 90s was when it became apparent that China and East Asia, and Asia generally, were consuming more and more petroleum. And that was going to put steady upward pressure on the world price of petroleum. I didn't check Brent crude today, but it's still over $100 a barrel last I knew. And that's historically very high. And the period I'm talking about in the late 90s, it was like 15, 20, 25. Cheney became aware, I think, that the world had changed. As of the late 90s, the world wasn't producing enough petroleum to meet increasing Asian demand at a reasonable price. And what would happen if the price of petroleum and hydrocarbons generally went up, because typically they track with one another, is renewables would become viable, which would, of course, make Halliburton worthless. So what you really needed was big new fields, but the geologists weren't finding them, and Cheney bought big magnetic imagery equipment. He wanted to give the world an MRI and find, where the fields were, but they weren't finding them. They're probably not there. I mean, they're deep in the Pacific and hard to get at and so forth. But there are two places where there's lots of petroleum, which is near the surface, easy to develop, and would increase world supply in such a way as to bring the price down below the renewables. And those are called Iraq and Iran. But there's a problem. They're under sanctions. Iraq is under UN sanctions. Iran and Iraq are both under congressional sanctions. So Cheney goes to Congress and lobbies them. And he talks dirty about Congress. He had served in Congress. But he says they're lazy. You can't just slap sanctions on countries. We need to get in there. This is hurting American business. So he lobbied them to take the sanctions off Iraq and Iran. But they declined. Partly it was the Israel lobbies were afraid that if Iraq and Iran got rich off of their petroleum, if the sanctions went away and they could freely sell, that they would become increasingly powerful and they'd pose more of a military threat to Israel. I think that's why Cheney changed his mind. If you can't beat them, join them. When he shows up in Washington, you know, Bush appointed him to find a vice president, and he looked high and low among the then 280 million Americans and just couldn't find a suitable candidate, and reluctantly volunteered for the job himself. But then when he showed up in Washington in January of 2001, he was surrounded by Scooter Libby and all of these neoconservatives from the right wing of the Israel lobbies. And I think it's because he decided that if you can't get the sanctions lifted from Iran and Iraq, then you do regime change. And it comes to the same thing, right? If you did regime change, then you can get Congress to take the sanctions off, and then the oil will come online. And in this regard, you know, Cheney won the Iraq War because the oil, Iraqi petroleum, will come online. And it will lower the international price. That's what he wanted, I think. But then there's this problem with Iran. Is, you know, if they could have, they would have gone on to Iran in 2004. If Iraq had gone well, if they could have just lopped off Saddam and put in Ahmed Chalabi, they would, you know. And then the neocons said this. And in spring, I remember in spring of 2003, there was this saying in Washington that everybody wants to go to Iraq. Real men want to go to Tehran. Well, Iran was aware that it had a lot of enemies. The revolutionary regime in Iran is not a nice regime, but it hasn't been aggressive. I mean, Iran hasn't invaded another country. I have an argument with my friend Abbas Amonat at Yale. I say it hasn't invaded another country since 1854 when it invaded Afghanistan, but he maintains that that part of Afghanistan that they invaded was traditionally part of Iran, so it wasn't an invasion of another country. And then you'd have to go back to 1785 when the Iranians took Basra. So it hasn't been an aggressive country, and it's not because they're nicer than everybody else. It's a vast country, thinly populated. It's hard to get people together for a war. But it hasn't been in the last 30 years either an aggressive country. But it has all of this petroleum, and it adopted an increasingly anti-Israeli stance. And it's seen as a threat by Saudi Arabia. It's seen as a threat by Israel. And the U.S. Increasingly wants that regime gone. And so, in the past few months, since July 1st of this year, the Congress passed an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which specified that the U.S. should prevent countries around the world from buying Iranian petroleum. Does this sound familiar? And the U.S. has gradually put the most severe sanctions in history on Iran, and has used its control of the international banking system to throw Iran off of all the banking exchanges so Iran can't get paid for its petroleum. It's actually harmed, you know, like the South Korean economy and the Indian economy by these steps. But the intention appears to be to get Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf countries to flood the market, to produce extra petroleum so that they can take the 2.5 million barrels a day that Iran produces off the market without putting the price way up. The price is still historically high, in large part because of these Iran sanctions. It drove me crazy during the presidential campaign. You had all of these candidates attacking Obama for the high price of gasoline, and then turning around and saying he's not sanctioning Iran enough. Well, what do they think is causing the gasoline to be so high as you've taken 1 million barrels a day off the market with these sanctions? Well, why are they sanctioning Iran so much? They say it's because Iran has a nuclear enrichment program. Well, I don't buy it. The Iranians did start experiments with enriching uranium in around 2000. And they were small experiments, and they ought to have reported them because they're signatories to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. They ought to have reported them to the UN immediately. They didn't. And a dissident group found out about it and blew the whistle on them. And in late 2002, the Iranians admitted that, yes, they had a small enrichment program. Now, they maintain that the enrichment program is for civilian use. They want to enrich uranium to run reactors with the fuel. And that's consistent with what they have been doing. In the old days, you could tell if somebody was trying to make a bomb because they had breeder reactors and so forth. But now they're using centrifuge technology. Centrifuge technology is inherently open-ended. You put the stuff in and whirl it around, and it separates out, and you get U-235 for a bomb. If you do that a little bit, you get 3.5%, you can run a nuclear reactor off of it. You do it a little bit more, you get 19.75%. You can run a medical reactor off of it, get isotopes to treat cancer. You put it back in and run it a lot more, centrifuge, you end up with 95%, and boom, you've got a bomb. So the international community is very suspicious that Iran's centrifuges are potentially dual use. But here's what I'm going to tell you. The supreme leader of Iran, who's a theocrat, gave a fatwa that making and stockholding and using nuclear weapons is contrary to Islamic law, because Islamic law of war is like the medieval Catholic one. You can't kill children and women and non-combatants, and what does a nuclear bomb do but kill all those people? I can't get anybody to take seriously that the supreme leader of Iran has given this fatwa. I mean, that he gave it is not in doubt. But it's very contradictory. Americans in Iran, they complain. They say, that's a theocracy. Religion is control of that place. They cut off people's hands for thieving, and they stone adulterers, and they're just theocrats. Then you say, but the theocrats said that they can't have nuclear weapons. They say, wow, that's just nonsense. He doesn't mean it. It's insincere. So, I don't know. It seems to me like it's a theocracy. He probably means it. I think what they want is the Japan option. The Japanese government has 2 tons of plutonium. I find that very suspicious. What are they doing with 2 tons of plutonium? What can you use plutonium for? And why do they have 2 tons of it? I mean, do you know how long it would take to run that through a reactor? And then the private companies in Japan have more, which could be requisitioned by the government. And everybody knows, this is called the Japan option, or the nuclear latency, that if China or North Korea came after them, the Japanese, are good at gadgets. They could have a bomb really quickly. So I think the Iranians want that. And the United States and Israel and Western Europe don't want the Iranians even to have the Japan option, because it's a form of deterrence. I mean, you won't invade a country that could put together a bomb really quickly, right? From the time Bush announced he was going to Iraq to the time he actually went was 8 or 9 months. So Iran wants to be in a position, I think, where it could make a bomb if it needed to. I don't think they want to make a bomb per se. And the U.S. and its allies don't want Iran to be in that position, and I find that very suspicious. Why would you be so upset that somebody would have, as Bush said, the know-how to make a bomb? Why would you be so upset if Iran had the Japan option? Because it's a deterrence? Wouldn't that suggest that you wanted to keep your options open about whether maybe you might like to invade them? So that's, in my view, what's really going on. And I think over the next few years, we're going to play this out. The sanctions on Iran are so deadly that they could spark a war in and of themselves. I mean, I think Obama thinks that the sanctions are an alternative to war. But, FDR wrote the Japanese in 1940, and he said, we're going to cut you off from American petroleum. And the Japanese needed American petroleum to keep their empire going. So basically, FDR was telling them to sit down and shut up. They lost China. Well, there was other oil in the world. It was in Indonesia. The Dutch had that. And Philippines was in American hands on the way. And then the Fifth Fleet Roosevelt brought up to Hawaii to threaten the Japanese with. So we all know how the Japanese dealt with that problem. They sunk the Fifth Fleet, they invaded the Philippines and Indonesia and got the oil and tried to keep the empire going. Well, it worked for a little bit. But it was, in some ways, Roosevelt's ultimatum that caused the war. And basically, right now, the United States has turned to Tehran and saying, we're cutting you off from oil. It's a very dangerous situation we're in, folks. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.